Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, From Flower to Diamonds, Part 2, using technology and data to increase quality and your competitive edge in the cannabis market. My name is Eric Sandy, and I'm the digital editor at Cannabis Business Times. I'm very pleased today to welcome you to the sequel to Agrify's panel discussion on August 31st. Agrify's experts are back to address your questions and to dive deeper into using technology and data to produce quality cannabis SKUs. You've heard the phrase fire in equals fire out, and that's applicable in all methods of cannabis extraction and processing. The first step to crafting top-tier extracted products is growing premium flower. From controlling the environment and stressors to proper measuring techniques, technology is required for success. And in this webinar, we're about to get into the important technologies and procedures your business should explore to effectively bring unique and attractive SKUs to market. Before we begin, just a few quick notes. You'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. And if you click that, you'll get the Q&A box where you can type in your questions as the presentation is going on. We're going to gather all those questions and try to get to as many as possible on the back end of this panel discussion. Secondly, just know that we are recording, so we'll have the archived video and audio from today's presentation, and we're going to email that directly to all registrants in the coming days, so you will have a copy of this for posterity. And now, I'm very pleased to get this panel discussion going, and I'm going to welcome Kevin Serwatowski, the Vice President of Sales at Agrify. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Eric. We hope everybody had a chance to check out the Flower to Diamonds Part 1. If not, you can go check it out online. It was a wealth of information. And, you know, after that, we decided to send out a survey to some of the attendees, and we asked them a couple of core questions to kind of understand what some of their pain points was and challenges that they're facing. So we're going to dive into some of those and give you guys some answers. The first one was when we asked what you're currently struggling with the most during your operations right now. One of the biggest ones that stood out was township approval. So, you know, township approval is a tough one because every township's a little different. Every AHJ, authority having jurisdiction, you might refer to it as, has kind of a different process. Some are mature markets, some aren't, right? So there's some things that we just can't control there. But we're going to talk a little bit about how we can help push that along for you or provide you the resources to be successful during that process. I would say one of the most important ones that I want to start out with there is a good design and getting off the ground right and knowing what that's going to look like so you can share to the township what your facility is ultimately going to be. So David, if you want, why don't you kick us off with a little bit of information on cultivation design, and then I'll go over some stuff on the extraction end.
I'd be happy to, Kevin. So, you know, when you think about the jurisdiction having authority, the township, this is the location where your cultivation facility or extraction facility is going to live. You're going to employ people from that community. You're going to pay taxes into that community, and you're going to help support them. And that is part of being a good partner. But what they want to know is that you're going to be a good partner long-term, that if they're going to take the time to put you through all of these approvals, that you're going to be able to operate effectively and in the long term. So that goes directly to the quality of the design itself, because the more efficient your design, the more well thought out the cultivation or extraction facility, the easier it's going to be to operate, and ultimately the lower cost you can achieve, which makes you more viable in the marketplace. So, you know, when you start thinking about the design, a couple of things come to mind. A lot of people focus solely on maximizing the output, whether that's the most flower they can produce out of a space or the most concentrate they can put out of a lab. But when you think about the design from the A&E standpoint, the architectural engineering, you're thinking about other things. You're thinking about workflow. How do people move through the building? Is it efficient? Is it safe? You're thinking about biosecurity. How do you lay out hallways, changing areas, air curtains and exits in a way that minimizes potential infiltration of diseases and pests or pathogens? You're also thinking about the material selection, and going through the design process, you're going to be doing everything from selecting your wall materials to your door schedule. And that means you're going to be choosing between drywall and fiberglass reinforced plastic or FRP or other materials. as some general tips, what we find for the long-term benefit of any cultivation facility or extraction facility is sanitizability. You want to be able to clean thoroughly the space. And so we really do prefer non-porous materials. So get away from drywall and go towards FRP. Think about, instead of a cement floor, some sort of coating like a epoxy or a sealant. But ultimately, it goes into the design of these facilities, their longevity, the optimization of the processes. Mike, do you have anything just off the top to add to how the townships might be able to, or how we might be able to better provide services for the townships to get those approvals?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest advantages to working with a company like us is that, we've worked on various standards. I know that currently some of our team members are working on the NFPA guidelines. I've personally worked on UL guidelines as well as ISO. So doing so kind of, one, gets the company into the AHJ's mind. And then not only that, but we really know what they're looking for. So a lot of the township approvals that get delayed, that it has to do with people not, one, the AHJ not knowing what they're regulating, and two, people not knowing exactly how to prepare for what regulations are either going to come or what they'd like to see. So having a partner in that, which we have various paid services that we offer at Agrify on the cultivation and extraction side to really help guide people who are building those business plans through that initial process to expedite that initial timeline. Because I can tell you right now, and I'm sure Kevin could speak to this too, and Ben, the biggest delays on projects are often in the approvals and the licensing up front. So your time to market is often dictated by your willingness to pay money up front to be compliant.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there, Mike. And I'll just add one thing, is that those specs that you started to mention, we've been heavily involved in the creation of those. Some of them are in the works of changing and evolving, and they will be for some time, because these specs didn't exist before. And so now they're being created to try to help create proper regulation for safety and repeatability. But they do have some nuances that are a little bit difficult to navigate at times. And so really, truly understanding these specifications helps you create a successful roadmap for your business, because that really is the goal, and we can help expedite that process.
Ben, that's a great point. And I think also one of the things to address is from the township side, where they sometimes get hung up, are where they're worried, whether properly so or misinformed, about the impact of cannabis on the community, and whether that's as a negative in terms of the drug, or whether it's, the odor from the facilities emanating out. Having groups like Agrify that have built odor mitigation plans, that have talked to the townships, that have stood at dozens and dozens and dozens of town councils and presented these ideas, defended these concepts. It's really vital, because at the end of the day, it's not proving you're right or wrong. It's really about getting them to feel like you have this under control. If they feel at the end of that meeting like this is a good plan, the team is going to be able to execute, you're very likely to get that approval you're looking for. But if they have doubts about you, the team, the quality of the plan you put forth, it's going to be very hard to get those approvals.
Yeah,
that's right. And a lot of times the fire department is a critical piece of this. So someone that you might think when you're starting your business that it's like just a little thing here and there, it's really not. And so I would get heavily involved with your fire department and understand and get to know those people, because if you can build and maintain a relationship with your fire department, you will save a lot of time and money through the approval process.
And one thing to add to that, I know, Kevin, I know there's something on the tip of your tongue too, but something really interesting that I've noticed, especially, and the reason I worked with UL to help create the UL TG 4402, so it's 44002, that technical guideline was created to be given to AHJs so that, hey, here's a document that tells you how to regulate what I'm doing, because half of them don't know what to do. And the people that actually were on the board to actually create that document were engineers, industrial hygienists, various equipment manufacturers, and electricians. So what's really great about, you can actually provide that document to your local AHJ to make your process easier. So those documents are for purchase online. That's something I'd encourage you to even look at, because although it's a small expense, I think they're like a couple $100 to $300. You're literally giving, if first of all, if you read it and you're compliant to it, now your plan is compliant to this guideline, and now your AHJ is actually going to regulate you based on the guideline that you built your business to. So it's a really great way to kind of close that loop and build that relationship.
Yeah, and if you notice, a common theme we just talked about there is communication with the AHJ and developing trust with them. So, whether it be Agrify and some of our services, or making the proper investment into a consultant or a firm that can help with this, it goes a long way, because it really shows, in some of these newer markets, especially where the fire inspectors, they don't, these people doing these approvals want to do things right? They want to look good. So knowing that they can trust in you as either an applicant or a licensee, like moving forward with the project, knowing they can trust you, knowing that you're working with a reputable firm, that really goes a long way. So yeah, I would say definitely think about, if you don't have the internal resources, looking to, like I said, ourselves or another partner out there that can help you through that.
Great advice, Kevin. I had one more thought just to add to Mike's comments on UL and standards. The standards aren't just for electrical equipment or extraction. They cover just about all aspects of this industry. And if they don't already, they're being developed to do so. So for a long time, lighting all fell under either commercial or residential lighting under UL, which is Underwriter Laboratories, a third-party certification agency. But recently, a few years ago, they came out with UL 8800, which was a standard for indoor horticultural cultivation equipment, because they realized that a cultivation environment is very different than a room in your home. It's going to have higher humidity. It's going to be requiring higher levels of electricity. There'll be much greater fluctuations in the day-night temperatures and humidities, which can impact electronics differently. So they were held to a higher degree of standard in terms of requiring more safety equipment, more factors to protect your employees, to protect yourself, your investments, and also, in this instance, the township, because they don't want you to have a fire in their community, and nor do we. So again, following these best practices, aligning with these standards, understanding them, it can be as easy as selecting the right piece of equipment that has a UL stamp versus accidentally choosing something that doesn't. But if you're buying equipment of any type right now that isn't certified, I would say that it's going to be really tough to get it through any JHA. JHA, jurisdiction having authority, AHJ, authority having jurisdiction. They're kind of interchangeable depending on which part of the world you're in. But at the end of the day, everybody, again, follow the standards, set yourself up for being the most rigid and adherent to those standards, and you'll stay out of a lot of the compliance kerfuffles that people can get into.
Awesome. Well, that was great feedback, guys. Yeah, I think if everybody takes some notes there, I think they can probably progress their process even a lot faster based on where they're at today. So let's move on to the second one. And not a surprise, right? Again, going back to the question, what are some of the current challenges you face? High costs. Okay, we had a large portion of the people that said high costs. So David, do you want to maybe explain, keep it top level if we were to pick the heavy hitters, right? How can people grow more efficiently? What type of techniques can they, use to produce valuable flower at a lower cost?
The first is having an integrated system. I think when you are designing a lot of the traditional cultivation facilities, you're having lighting that's producing a lot of heat, air conditioning that's removing heat, a dehumidifier that's removing moisture, but you also need a humidifier because depending on the part of the day and the environment, the size of the plants, you need to achieve different environments. And so ultimately you end up with equipment that's fighting each other. And so having a system that's well engineered and designed is going to allow you to minimize those input costs and really ultimately bring down that cost of production. You know, when you think about the cost of production, there's a couple things that really are important to understand. Number one, the only areas in your facility that actually generate revenue are the cultivation flowering areas, the cultivation canopy that's generating revenue, and the lab that's actually doing the extraction and formulating those products. But without that biomass, you can't really go in any of these other steps. So when you're looking at your facility, you want to make sure that your flowering areas are producing as much and as efficiently as possible. In addition, the two biggest line items of cost in any operation for cultivation, I think I'll turn it over to Mike and Ben on the extraction side, but for cultivation are your personnel, your people, which absolutely are your best resource and worth paying for, and then your electricity, your utilities. And so using energy efficient equipment, things like LED lighting over your traditional HIDs, minimizing your peak power demand, which is the most power you pull at any point in a monthly cycle, by say having half of your flowering room on at 12 a.m. to 12 p.m. and the other 12 p.m. to 12 a.m., it minimizes that peak draw and ultimately is going to deliver you a much lower electrical bill, thereby bringing down your costs. And so, you know, when you start thinking about how you can produce more efficiently, it's going to be around your personnel. So making those processes more efficient. I do not recommend you try and pay people less. Instead, make their jobs better, make it more ergonomically comfortable, give them the tools that allow them to perform their job more quickly. And then when it comes to the utilities, just be judicious with, you know, the equipment you select and make sure that you're not fighting one piece of equipment with another. Mike, what would you think, or Ben, on the extraction side that you could do to bring those costs down?
You know, when you're talking about equipment, we've definitely seen a shift over the years. I would say if you walked into an extraction facility 5 years ago, you would have seen a lot of labor, a lot of bodies everywhere. And that's because so many things were manual. Including the packaging process, which I would say is still probably the highest kind of labor portion of the extraction process, is the manually packaging and labeling. And so, you know, we've seen a shift over the years as we've not only improved the equipment and the processes, but just made the whole operation run a lot more streamlined through the production of the products. And I would say that there's still room for improvement in the packaging.
You know what, too? I wanted to throw one in there, actually. This is really a people thing, right? So when I look at, you know, small to maybe mid-sized businesses, they may not have somebody in place or have the, you know, the power to do process improvement and try to look for those things. So until you have somebody in place to do that, don't forget to reach out to your vendors, your partners, the people you bought equipment from. You know, reach out to these folks and ask them, you know, what do you have new? Is there anything, do you have a maintenance program, whatever that may be? And also kind of along those same lines, be open to new technology. And if you're not in the field doing it and you're a leader, push your team to be open to technology and to look at new things. We all know people have their ways of doing things, and sometimes we get stuck in those ways, right? But there's new stuff coming out every day in agriculture and cannabis and extraction. So stay on top of that. And there might be some natural things right in front of you that you can, you know, increase your efficiency on for not that high of cost. So, yep, that's
you know, Kevin, you're spot on there, because we've got such a new industry, really in its infancy here. And if you look at the amount of innovation that happens in industries that have been around for 50 or 100 or even 200 years, and they're still innovating and creating new products and game-changing equipment, you know, what we're seeing now is, if anyone that thinks that what we're going to do today is going to be the exact method that we'll use 50 years from now is crazy, because what we're doing today will probably be highly unrecognizable from what we do 50 years from now. So I think we're in the moment of change and evolution and technology and development. And this is the fun time when we get to see all of this happen. And so I think opening your minds is an absolute must if you want to stay alive let alone succeed in this industry.
Yeah, I think when it comes to, the high costs, obviously you got two different types of costs that we're talking about. We got high OpEx, high CapEx, right? Typically, in order to get low OpEx, low operating expense, we need to have high CapEx up front. So, or if you're going to have high operating expenses, you're probably not going to spend as much money up front on your CapEx. And what I mean by that is economies of scale and automation, right? So there's different levels of a lot of our different pieces of equipment. We've got different levels, we've got different sizes, different economies of scale. Coming into into a business plan where you're trying to compete with an existing market, you're going to need to probably have more initial investment into your business so that your operating expenses can bring you down to a level where you're going to be long-term competitive. So high costs of operation can be mitigated by two factors: economies of scale and automation. A lot of the companies in the industry, everybody's working on the hunt towards automation. And when you look at all, talking about what Ben and Kevin were just getting at, all these other industries, that's where they end up, right? The more places that we can create automation, that we can reduce the amount of operating expense, is how we help our customers be long-term successful. So to me, coming into a newer market, you can get away with a higher operating expense with maybe some lower capital expenditure to test out and kind of prove a business model and prove a concept. But if you're going into a state like Colorado or a state like Michigan or a state like California, Nevada, you can't come in and expect to spend low capital expense on equipment and then be competitive long term. It's just not going to be realistic. So I think that's one of the biggest things that we try to explain to our customers through that process is, look, like, of course we want to sell you equipment, but we want you to be successful so that you buy more equipment from us. So we try to, be a partner in the actual conceptual development of a business plan.
Very, very good point, Mike. So it looks like we covered that one. So let's move on. This one's an interesting one. So about a fifth of people are okay. No, actually, this was a low response. So keeping up with extraction trends and technology. It didn't seem like many people had problems with that, but like I mentioned before, keep up with your vendors. That's a quick one we can pass through. Keep up with your vendors. Keep an eye out online. Do your research on what's out there. But about a fifth of you said how to extract and concentrate THC without chemicals. So before I pass that on, I'm just going to make a kind of an overarching comment regarding that. There's always a place for different solvents, different types of processing. Going back to that being open thing, make sure you're doing your own research and not getting, some of the articles online or some scare tactics. A lot of these solvents that we use are what we call generally recognized as safe. And honestly, a lot of the products in your house that you walk by on a daily basis, you'd be surprised, also use various methods of extraction. So states have protections in place to make sure they keep what we call residual solvents down, different levels for different states. And as long as you have good equipment and you're doing the process right, you can keep those down and ultimately remove that from the final product. But with that being said, I guess Mike or Ben, I don't know who'd want to take that one best.
Happy to jump in with the solvent side of things. So it's interesting, the industry has this perception that, solvents are these bad chemicals and that there's all these bad chemicals if there's a solvent extraction that's happening. And to be completely frank, solvent extraction is pretty much used in almost all of the household products that you may consume on a daily basis. I actually did a quick little Google to see if Advil had any residual solvent in it. And sure enough, there's multiple scholarly journals that show that there's small amounts of ethanol in there. There's caffeine is often extracted with heptane, and you can find residual amounts of heptane in titrated coffees. There's a certain level of residual solvent that's actually acceptable in all foods and food grade products. So when we look at that and we try to understand, looking back at the chemical processes that are behind those, it's often the most safe way or the most efficient way to extract things from biomass. So as long as your process, if you're using clean upfront solvents, if you're doing butane extraction or propane extraction, you're distilling your solvent, you're filtering your solvent. If you're buying ethanol or isopropanol or heptane, if you're buying that from a chemical supplier, you're going to want to make sure you get HPLC grade, lab glass distilled. The highest grade, HPLC grade is high pressure liquid chromatography. Those would be analytical level solvent grades. They're usually extremely pure because we're looking at very small amounts of things when we're doing analytics. So the solvents need to be at a very high purity so they don't interrupt that process. So as long as you're using these high grade solvents and you're following proper SOPs put in place by either the equipment manufacturers or the internal people in the know, you're going to have clean product in the end. So, you can absolutely do different mechanical separations, and I'll let Ben kind of jump into that in a moment. And we actually had a great question that we can kind of hit on, which it ties into the last subject, which is how do you see solventless extraction becoming more automated in the future? And that's right there. That question is a lot of why solvents are used, because you can automate those processes at scale. You can create larger scale economies of scale using solvent extraction. And as long as you're cleaning it up in the end, you're going to have a good product. So I'll let Ben talk about a little bit of the scale considerations and how we can extract concentrate without chemicals.
Yeah, so like Mike was mentioning, we have some techniques. There's actually 2 techniques that work quite well, that we can separate and concentrate THC to as high a purities as 96 or so percent, without using any chemicals or distillation. And we're doing that we can do it in 2 ways. One way, we can do it in the rosin press. So when we have either ice water, hash, or rosin that we've already pressed or whatever it is, but if we have an oil, a concentrate inside of a filtration bag and we put it in the rosin press, we can actually separate out different compounds by their melting point. And we're going to take advantage of the temperature of those melting points to separate the compounds. So starting out low, we're going to see terpenes and some THC come out with that, but a lot of really nice, super thin, very nice smelling, very nice tasting liquids at the beginning of the extraction at the low temperatures. And then as we work our way up in temperature, actually the very last thing to come out is THC. It has the highest melting point. So if we've stripped everything else out properly before it, meaning that we've pressed at multiple different temperatures, working our way up, by the time we get to around 275 to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, we're left with nothing but pure THCA within that filtration bag. And we can either heat that up and press it out, or we can open the filtration bag and remove it. And at that point, it'll look like white crystals, like diamonds. And so the other method that we have is actually a separation technique where we're utilizing the vapor pressure and time. And so we'll put a concentrate and oil into a jar and we'll put it in an oven and we'll build that vapor pressure and we'll let it sit. And then we'll actually create a process where the THC will want to crystallize within that liquid. And so we can crystallize and then essentially pour off the remaining liquid and separate the THC that way. That is a slower process, but it does require much less labor. So there's the benefit of that. However, if you want to do it right now and you need it now, you can do it on a rosin press and you'll put some labor into it, but you can actually separate those compounds out. So do you want me to hop into some of the scalability now, or do we want to just move into that later on?
Ben, maybe before you do, I just wanted to jump on one thing so that we can touch on the high cost before we move on. Mm-hmm. There's 2 things. One, iterative improvements. If you're not collecting data and understanding how your performance is, whether it's on the output of your extraction or on your cultivation, you're really missing out. You know, the days of cultivators and lab extractors not collecting data because it was the legacy market are over. Data drives optimization. If you don't measure it, you can't improve it. So really, whether it's your automated technology like Agrify that's recording millions of data points for you, or whether you're still out there with a clipboard and paper, whatever it is, that data is incredibly useful for mining good insights. The other thing that I want to point out for people trying to keep their costs down, folks, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of the commercial agriculture, a lot of the extraction equipment, these processes for efficiency already exist. Now, they might not exist for cannabis, but extraction technology has been used for everything from decaffeinating coffee to making perfumes for a very long time. We can learn an enormous amount from how it's done commercially at scale. The same is true for cultivation. Look at commercial agriculture, understand the economics, because if you want to see how things scale up, look at someone with 2 or 3 acres under glass, go to 50 acres under greenhouse. And look at tissue culture. You know, it was developed originally around orchids, and now it's really in a hot topic for cannabis. But you can look to other plants outside of the cannabis industry for knowledge and information. So as you're looking to keep those costs down, looking outside of this industry for existing solutions and keeping that data flowing is going to be great ways to make sure you can take advantage and maximize the money you do put into your production.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Hey, Ben, before we move on, did you have something to add, or do you want to move on to the next?
Oh, that's good. That's good. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So, all right. So as one of the survey questions, we asked what you'd like us to discuss further in this part 2 segment. So we picked out a few of those. First one is going to be outdoor versus indoor cannabis, right? And I think specifically we'll start on outdoor and indoor cannabis and how it relates to the refinement process. Like, what's the difference between that starting point ultimately on your way to extraction or extracted products, excuse me. Mike, you want to take that one?
Sure. I figured David was going to jump on that because it was.
I'll give you a chance, Mike. I
got the weed leaf in the background, right?
I know, right? I was like the weed guy, you know. So I would say the biggest difference between indoor versus outdoor cannabis is going to be typically the quality that is going to be on the shelf. You know, you can grow incredible spectrums of cannabinoids. In fact, I would say that, and David, this is where I think that you'd probably be better at speaking to this. Outside, when you have the sun, you have, you know, more diversity in your soil. You've got more natural elements. You can often get some incredible, if not the most natural expressions of a plant. However, indoor, we have the ability to control and optimize different parameters to choose which different types of characteristics we want to exemplify out of a plant. So when you look at something, when you're trying to create a shelf-ready flower, you know, indoor cannabis is typically going to win that battle. When we're looking at extracts, we can also control a lot more of the contamination. We can control a lot more of the external factors that would affect the resins of the actual plant. So for, you know, large scale cultivation and large scale extraction, I would say outdoor is, you know, it's great because you can produce a whole lot of material at a very low cost, and you can extract it. And in the end, if you're doing, you know, distillates or different types of extractions that are going to result in more standardized materials, it's not going to really matter too much what your starting material was, aside from it being quality, you know, being clean and being high potency to begin with. If we're trying to produce shelf products like diamonds or, you know, hydrocarbon extracts, very high-end separations with Ben's equipment to make rosins, we're going to want really high-end indoor material typically to exemplify the lightest in the colors, the most terpene expression. So can you do it indoor or outdoor? Absolutely. I mean, there's no two ways about it. The sun has more spectrum and more light power than any light that we can produce inside. But in terms of controlling your process and mitigating different obstacles throughout your process, you know, indoor is definitely going to give you a lot more of that.
So it sounds like outdoor is really focused on distillate then, right? Where we're talking cartridges, edibles, beverages, things of that nature for the most part, I guess, generally speaking, right?
Kevin, Mike used a really important word, mitigated. Outdoors, you're growing in an unmitigated area. You're open to wind, rain, hail, smoke damage, bugs. Your ability to protect your plants, even from dust, is really limited. However, your cost of production is generally lower. Your cost of utilities is much lower. You might be using energy for pumps, but not generally for, you know, lighting, which again is you're going to be your primary cost there. So ultimately, you can produce more biomass less expensively outdoors. But if you even think about it, being that it's unmitigated, the weather is going to literally reduce the amount of trichomes that are on the exterior of that flower. And that makes it less desirable sometimes for extraction. To Mike's point, you can still get phenomenal expressions of the chemotype. You have a very healthy plant growing outdoors. The sunshine, while it does have cloudy days, is, as Mike said, one heck of a light bulb. You will hit your 2000 micromoles and be able to see a full expression. But if you're looking for consumable, combustible flower, I think indoor is generally deemed the highest quality because of that protected stance, because it can be cultivated with all optimal days. There's no clouds, there's no bugs if you're careful. And so ultimately the indoor product will have a higher price point and generally be a little bit more potent. And whether it's desirable for concentrate manufacture indoor versus outdoor, I think goes to what it is that you plan to produce and the cost of that starting material. And your state markets, everybody. What was really great you could do in Colorado when the price was $2,400 a pound now is limiting if you're only going to be able to get $700 a pound. And so with that in mind, you just want to be mindful of the state markets as well.
Absolutely. So let's move on to the next one, Katie. Application process. All right, I had application. So the application process. I think we covered it, I would say, fairly well in the beginning. Does anybody have anything to add based on what we already went through that we missed regarding the application process?
I can just say one thing. A lot of people try to do this stuff on their own, and I have more power to you, right? Everybody's, I'm a smart guy myself. I could probably write a cannabis application pretty quickly, but working with someone who's done it before, someone that's actually spent the time, who's done it in a specific state that you're trying to apply to, it can literally save you a heartache in the end that you might not be approved. He might have written 6 of the other applications that are in front of you. So spend the money up front. Don't sell your business short and try to do it yourself and don't skip to the front of the, to me, it's like if there's a shortcut in that type of game when you're dealing with legislation and regulatory agencies, take it.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, I'm sorry, Kevin. I was just going to add to that. Just know yourself, know your team, know your strengths, because to your point, it's good to hire a consultant if you're not able to put forth an answer, a winning answer for the questions. That said, vet your consultants, find out their history, check on what licenses they've won and in what states. Was it a competitive state or was it like Oklahoma where it's signing your name? But there's a huge degree and variability in the quality of consultants in this industry. That's why going to someone like us, like Agrify, that has dozens and dozens of people with years of experience that have been through this in every legal state market is a real benefit, because we bring that experience to bear on all of these situations.
Awesome. You want to go to the next one, Katie? How to make diamonds. I figured this would be an interesting one. Mike, you wanna take this one away?
Well, they're made within the earth at very high pressure over long periods. So how do we make diamonds? So there's a lot of different ways to do that. At least in terms of in this industry, it really depends. One, we have to figure out what kind of diamonds are we going to make? Are we making CBD diamonds? Are we making THCA diamonds? What kind of which cannabinoid do we want to crystallize? Because in all reality, not all of them crystallize. So typically when we're talking about diamonds, we're talking about THCA diamonds, which would mean non-decarboxylated, fresh, material. We're going to have to start with a non-decarboxylated product. And decarboxylation is the process when we heat up the cannabinoids to a certain activation temperature where CO2 is released. And then at that point, those cannabinoids can be actually received in our receptors within our body. So that's why if anyone's made edibles, you got to heat up the cannabis while it's within the butter. Basically what happens is the heat decarboxylates the cannabinoids, which would be going from THCA to THC, or otherwise known as delta-9 THC. And then from there, the fat, the butter, the olive oil, whichever we're trying to infuse, actually extracts or, dissolves those cannabinoids into the fat, because cannabinoids are fat soluble. So the reason I went into that is because it's extremely important that you don't try to crystallize or do any sort of precipitation with diamonds in the end as the intention of a decarboxylated product unless it's CBD. So going back to the fresh point. So typically the best way to make diamonds in the most efficient way that can be repeatable is through hydrocarbon extraction, specifically butane or propane. Most extractors are going to tell you that N-butane is the best for creating diamonds. At least that's what I've seen and heard. Typically, we're going to want to use a fresh frozen starting material. So essentially, right when that plant's ready to harvest, we're going to be chopping it down and freezing it, making sure that it's handled very well. We don't want it to be mishandled. Once that product is fully frozen through and through, it's ready for extraction. So at that point, you can either, it can stay in the freezer for a good amount of time, depending on how well it's sealed. But from there, we'd load it into a hydrocarbon extractor, similar to PX5, 10, or 20, or PX5, 10, or 30, sorry. From there, we'd run our extraction process. And at the end of our extraction, when we're actually ready to harvest that micella would be our cannabinoids with a little bit of solvent left in them. We're going to harvest it with a little bit of butane left in it. And this is a big thing with AHJs or regulatory agencies that are local. This can be a complicated process, especially in Denver. Denver really doesn't like making diamonds. They've made it very difficult. Depending on which state you're in and which city you're in, it could be different. I'd suggest researching the local jurisdictional rules before engaging in this operational procedure. And then essentially what we're going to be doing is, instead of purging our extract like we would make it in shatter inside of a vacuum oven with a whole bunch of surface area across of a flat surface, and we'd purge it within 24 to 48 hours, we're actually going to do this over a longer period of time typically. Obviously, it depends on what equipment you're using. There are rapid crystallizers out there. But essentially, our objective is that we want to cause the cannabinoids, the THCA specifically, to precipitate out of solution. Very similar to how you'd make rock candy in water. You'd supersaturate the water with sugar, and then once it hits a certain point in the cooling process, the sugar will actually start crystallizing around the strings that you have suspended into the water, and that's how rock candy's made. So it's very similar with cannabinoids, believe it or not. And in fact, if you research that precipitation crystallization process, you'd yield a lot of information to help you get that done. Major differences: instead of water, we're using terpenes and solvent, and instead of sugar, we're using cannabinoids. But otherwise, it's nearly the same process. And from there, you can produce very high quality extracts, and then you can finally do your final vacuum purge to remove any residual solvent in a vacuum oven once your crystals have precipitated. So that's kind of like the long and short of it. There's a lot of nuances to that process. I'd suggest, if you're interested in actually doing that process, we do have a lot of internal consultants that can come out to your facility and teach you on this. There's SOPs online on the Future 4200 forum. There's a lot of information around on this, but learning it from someone that has the experience and that has learned all the different nuances to it will skip you to the front of the line. Same thing I was saying before with the application process. It's better to learn from people who know and who have been vetted. Thank you for saying that, David. Than to try to figure it out yourself. We've already spent the money going through all these processes to learn how to dial them in. So why do it twice?
Mike, you mentioned it like making rock candy. In there, you can often seed the rock candy with a small crystal of sugar. Is that ever duplicated in cannabis? Is there a way to seed the mixture, which will get you to crystallization more quickly? Because as I understand it, it'll precipitate out and almost magnetically, like towards the crystal. It'll build on the crystal.
Oh, absolutely. Seeding is, in fact, the fastest way to trigger crystallization within a supersaturated solution. So once you have a supersaturated solution, throwing in some already harvested crystals that are like the shape that you want, obviously the same compound that you're trying to crystallize, is a fantastic way to trigger the process and also make it more efficient. So, and basically any crystal that you seed with will be replicated. So it actually does build on itself because it creates a surface that is actually ready for crystallization, nucleation point.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, brings me back to a memory when I learned to do that process with you at a lab many years back. So Katie, can you move on to the next one? I believe it kind of ties in, and I want to leave a few minutes for some of the other ones we have here. So Mike, since we just kind of came off the diamonds, kind of a similar overall process thing that you're doing, just in a different way with full spectrum CO2 to isolate, correct?
Very similar. Big difference would be is that typically full spectrum CO2 oil is going to be decarboxylated, because you typically actually would decarboxylate before even doing your supercritical CO2 extraction. And the reason for that is because the non-acidic forms of the cannabinoids, and acidic would be the fresh versions, the THCA, the CBDA, the CBGA. They are less soluble typically in supercritical CO2. There's obviously ways to do it that way, but most CO2 companies are going to be doing CO2. They're going to decarboxylate first, which they often do it in our Cascade forced air ovens. Great way to do it because they fit a whole bunch of material. You decarboxylate, and then from there you do your extraction. So by the time you're in full spectrum CO2 oil, you can't actually crystallize THCA. So you wouldn't be able to go to isolate with THCA using CO2 in that method. You could obviously do it without decarboxylating, but that's a whole nother subject. Now, if we're talking about CBD, CBD definitely can be crystallized and isolated out of CO2 extract. And the way that I would do that is I would not try to isolate the CO2 extract straight on. I would distill it first. And the reason for that is because when we distill, we remove a lot of the other things that are not what we want. Whenever you do an isolation process, it's best to start with the most pure material. Any sort of refinement process, you want to start with cleaner and cleaner material. So if we distill our CO2 extract, we're probably going to take the potency from in the 60s up to the 70s, maybe even the 80s, maybe the 90s, depending on how good you are and what other types of compounds are there. So now that we've taken that CBD extract up to a higher potency, let's just say 85%, now we go through the isolation process, which is very similar to the process I just described, different solvents, different process. We do teach that, as Kevin was talking about. Then we can actually harvest crystals through the same precipitation process of pure CBD. Now, again, so we're going to add a step between full spectrum CO2 oil, so crude oil, into distillate. And distillate would be the best way to get ready for isolation.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Mike. So I think we have time. If you can progress to the next slide. What I was thinking, if maybe just throw all those topics up there, if you don't mind. The reason I say that, we probably only have time for about one more, but it looks like two of them, David, kind of almost tie hand in hand. And I think this would be a good exit point here. In the front, they mentioned bio cross contamination of crops via neighboring operations, as well as pesticide contamination. Yeah. I think those tie hand in hand. Can you cover those at a high level?
Yeah, I'll go really quickly. There's actually a recent case in California where an avocado farmer and cannabis farmers were kind of going at each other because under the allowances of the Department of Ag, the avocado growers were spraying chemicals that they're allowed to. But we have what's called overspray, which is where that spray, that fine mist, can travel in the wind and then get onto neighboring properties and plants, and ultimately was the source of contamination for the cannabis plants that then made that product fail and ultimately unusable. So when it comes to cross-contamination from farms, you can use a little bit of, forethought, look at the topography, look at the natural barriers, go and spend a little bit of time and literally see which way the wind blows. In fact, you'll find wind has corridors and there's natural obstacles and stands of trees and certain hills. So you can use the actual layout of the land to help protect yourself, because otherwise there's not much you're going to be able to do. I mean, this is one person's livelihood interfering with another's. On the other side of contamination, you have grower on grower crimes. You have pollination is a big problem. So you have two producers that are both growing outdoors. One of them grows only feminized plants and the other has to cull their plants, which means remove the males. Well, if you don't do a great job of that, pollen can travel up to 200 miles on the wind current. And that means that you have high susceptibility for a seeded crop. And everyone knows that while a seeded crop can still be salvaged, it has a much, much lower price index, significantly lower. So you really want to be mindful. And this is why I think a lot of people have moved towards greenhouse and indoor production, because that protection, that mitigation, that ability to control is what lets you produce higher quality form factors. If you're just growing purely for extraction, if it gets seeded, it gets seeded. It's another step in the process, and it makes it harder. But at the end of the day, outdoor is really well suited for producing low cost milligrams of THC. And indoor and greenhouse are going to produce that higher quality, more controlled flower. And so it'll let you alleviate that concern of pesticide contamination, neighboring farmers contamination, and so forth.
Awesome. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Do you think, Eric, I think we should probably punt to some questions here. We got about 9 minutes left. What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds good. And actually, just while we're here at the crossroads, I know I put this in the chat earlier, but just one more time, I'm going to add the link to part 1 of this conversation, just because I guess obviously these 2 webinars work really well in tandem. We have gotten a few questions in the chat section and the Q&A box. We do have time for a few more if you want to add some in there, but let's start with this one that just came in a little while ago. How do you see solventless extraction becoming more automated in the future? And we had a similar question that was about scaling up work with the rosin press. So I guess this is a solventless question about both scale and automation.
Yeah. You know, I'm not going to kind of give away the secret sauce of what we're working on, but I will say that just like anything else, with automation, we can scale any process and remove the labor from it. And so we've got a lot of techniques and strategies that we can do that. And I think that with solventless, it shines when we are able to do automated batch style production. And so I think that will be kind of the next step in scaling solventless is automating that batch style production and removing the labor from that. So, you know, you're going to see different style washing systems, you're going to see different style pressing systems, but you're also going to see feeds and conveyance between everything so that we can truly remove that labor.
I know early at the top of this presentation, one of the things we talked about was just the big idea of keeping costs low, and that kind of colors everything else we're talking about. Someone in the chat here was asking about the cheapest process to make diamonds, but just in terms of making diamonds, what are some aspects that folks might want to look at to keep costs low, whether that's inputs or even equipment?
I can mention one thing, you know, just be careful what you see online, right? Not to say any of these methods are better than another, but, you know, in the past, for instance, we've seen people using traditional mason jars, let's say, and now we have diamond miners that are a safe way to do that and a way to do it compliantly, right? So I believe, as Mike mentioned earlier, too, hydrocarbon extraction is really the ideal starting point to make good diamonds. And then, like I said, diamond miners traditionally are what you'll see pretty much a vessel, right, Mike? What's a better way of saying that?
Yeah, so you hit it right on the head. Yeah, so the nice thing, the reason that hydrocarbons are so great for making crystals out of cannabinoids is because of the polarity of the actual solvents and the polarity of cannabinoids. So cannabinoids are nonpolar. So nonpolars will obviously, like dissolves like, they're going to dissolve and hold cannabinoids in them in solution. So that means that we can play with saturation curves, and saturation curves are ultimately how we cause precipitation crystallization to happen. So to Kevin's point, the really nice thing about butane is that, one, if you do it in a controlled environment, C1D1 space with a good extractor, you're going to be safe. Two, it's got such atmospheric conditions, it's a gas. So it actually isn't a traditional extract solvent. You know, in many industries, you won't see butane on the compatibility charts, nor will you see propane, because it's a gas, it's a refrigerant. But what's really nice about it when it's in liquid form in this process is that it can be boiled out very quickly and without a whole lot of energy. So in other words, we can quickly play with the saturation of a given extract within butane very easily. So that makes it nice. Pentane also is a good one. I would say the cheapest process is actually going to be utilizing a hydrocarbon extractor because instead of doing a secondary process where we're taking our extract and dissolving it into another solvent and adding a step and adding more, processing steps down the line, we can come right out of a hydrocarbon extractor right into a diamond miner that's certified, has the correct pressure release valve on it, have it within the controlled environment, do our precipitation, and then put it into some sort of vessel that we can then purge off the residual solvent. So definitely the cheapest and easiest way to do it for THCA. For CBD, like I was saying before, CBDA does not crystallize. Well, actually it does under certain circumstances, but generally speaking, in large quantity efficiently, you're going to want to produce CBD isolate as a decarboxylated CBD compound. So that actually leads into this other question. How about freeze drying? How does it help produce nice crystals for THC? I believe you mean THCA since you added carboxyl onto the end of it. So THCA would be THC with a carboxyl group on the end of it. You could use freeze drying, probably. I don't think a whole lot of people are doing that. I think at least for crystal production, just because typically you're going to want to form them out of a solution via supersaturation. However, I think this also kind of leads into the solventless diamonds portion here, which was another question. You definitely can produce solventless diamonds. And it looks like David and Ben can answer that one. But in all reality, the most efficient, quickest, cheapest way is probably going to be butane.
Yeah. It's funny with the diamonds too. One thing I thought was cool, I encourage everybody to go out and try diamonds. I was a high times judge this year for Michigan, and one of my favorite products was a live diamond in sauce. So you could actually put the diamonds next to the sauce in a little split jar. And it's interesting because when you adjust a little higher the diamonds, you're going to get that head high versus a little more of the sauce. It's going to be more of a traditional full body high. So go out there and experiment with the products and see what you like. And that's ultimately going to feed your ideas and R&D for your own brand and your own lab.
Yeah, solventless diamonds, I guess we could touch on those really quick. And Ben, feel free to throw in any info here. Typically, it's a little different because we're not using a solvent to cause this super saturation curve to happen, to drop and precipitate out crystals. So how do you do it? Well, in rosin, especially if you're doing live rosin, there's usually a very high terpene content. And that's why there's some of the terpiest extracts that are out there. And when you have terpenes present, and if you can keep your rosin in more of a liquid form, you can actually follow a similar procedure using different heated ovens to actually get precipitation to occur. And I'll let Ben take it from there.
Yeah. Essentially, we're doing the same thing, but we're utilizing the terpenes, like you said, to create the vapor pressure. It can take 1 to 2 weeks, so it's not necessarily a fast process, but it works, and it works quite well. And I would say that there's a lot of labs that are currently using this process, using either a vacuum oven or just a standard high control oven to set these jars in there or these vessels, and we'll do it at a relatively low temperature, but like I said, for a long period of time. The other option you have, like I said, is to do it on a rosin press. It's not going to necessarily give you a crystallized diamond structure though. On the rosin press, what we can do is more create like kind of a shattered diamond dust, if you will.
So an important point here is the size of crystals when we're talking about diamonds. And to Ben's point that he was kind of getting at there in terms of structure, when you have, the more pure a mixture is, the more pure a starting material is, the bigger the diamonds you can theoretically grow. It also depends on the terpenes that are present. Terpenes can co-crystallize. They can also cause different ratios of molecular structure within the actual crystallizing solution. So when you look at rosin and you're trying to make diamonds out of rosin, rosin has a much more diverse amount of compounds in it due to the actual process of mechanical separation. So as a result, you're going to have a lot smaller crystal structure. Typically, you're not going to see giant, blown out diamonds most likely, just because of the initial purity of the actual concentrate that you start with.
Yeah, and it looks like Zach is saying in the Q&A here that you can heat treat after you press. That's exactly right. You can also pour it into a mold, which is actually a really cool thing that I've seen, is to mold the THC after it's been pressed into different shapes and then pour the sauce over it. Cool way to add your branding into the mold. You can create a custom shape or size. I've seen some that look like lifesavers, different shapes, and they're pretty neat. So that's absolutely right. You can manipulate it after the fact.
Love it. Well, I think that's a cool note to end on there. Covered a lot of really fantastic information here. And again, it was just nice to sort of flow from our conversation a couple of weeks ago into this one. I want to thank everybody for attending out there in the audience, and remind you all that, you know, we were recording this. We'll be sending the video out to everybody very soon here via email. So keep an eye out for that. And of course, want to thank Mike, Ben, David, Kevin, Katie behind the scenes, the whole Agrify team, for a fantastic discussion today. Really appreciate it. And this was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah,
everyone.
Thank you.
Appreciate everyone listening. Have a great day.